Good evening, everyone. My mic is the one is not hot, so I'm having to hold it very close to my mouth. I'm Marianne Brownlow. Welcome to Hill Center. Thank you so much for coming this evening. For the past 13 years, we have absolutely been privileged to have veteran journalist Bill Press do these regular, in-depth conversations with just the most distinguished, important people in DC, and I just can't even begin to list who his guests have been. But tonight, no one more distinguished, certainly, than author Lynne Olson. And, she is a New York Times best-selling, award-winning author. Her latest book is The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, and our friends and neighbors, East City Bookshop, woman-owned independent bookstore just a few blocks away, are selling her books. Please support them. And thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to turn it over to Bill.
I'm ready.
All right.
Thanks, Marianne. So good to see all of you tonight. Thanks for coming out. I have to tell you, this is kind of a family affair tonight. Just a quick little backstory. It was a couple of months ago. Carol and I were having dinner at the home of good friends, Senator Byron Dorgan and his wife Kim, who are here tonight, with Linda Douglas, former ABC News, and John Phillips, former ambassador to Italy. And Byron mentioned that they were planning a trip to Egypt. And I said, oh my God, don't go to Egypt until you read this book, Empress of the Nile. And Byron said, I've already read it. Lynne Olson, she's a friend of mine. At which I said, what? She lives in DC, you know her. Can you connect us? And with the help of another friend, Nina Benton, she did connect us. And so here we are. We're all together tonight. So thank you, Senator, and thank you, Lynne. And it's great to see you. And those of you who have been here to other events, we don't always have authors, but I think we often do. You know that I read a lot of books, right? And I want to tell you honestly, I think Citizens of London, Empress of the Nile, and The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, I learned tonight, by the way, that's the pronunciation, Ravensbrück, are three of the best books I've ever read in my life. Seriously. Every one of them, Lynne, is just incredible. The way you can find someone or some place or some event in the past and bring it to life for all of us is just incredible. A great historian, and your writing is so beautiful, and it's really very compelling.
Thank you so much. Wow.
So let me start with Ravensbrück. I must say, I never heard of it before this book. So what was it? Where was it? And when did you first hear about it?
I am amazed at how many people have never heard of Ravensbrück. This was my 10th book. This is my latest book, my 10th book, and most of my books, all but one, have been about World War II, so I'm fairly familiar in Europe, the Eastern Theater. So I'm fairly familiar with what went on at that time, and so I had heard of Ravensbrück. It was the only all-women's German concentration camp. But since the book came out, I am stunned by, I suspect, many, I'm not even going to ask, but many of, not most of you have heard of it. But I'm really amazed at how many people have never, ever heard of it. I don't know why, but I am. And so let me tell you, those of you who don't know that much about it, the reason is because it was, I think, for a number of reasons. One, it was all women. But the major reason is, or one of the major reasons is that unlike the camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, which were liberated by American troops, at the close of the war, near the close of the war. Because they were liberated by American troops, there were American journalists who were covering the troops. And so they were there when Dachau, Buchenwald, the best known of the non-death camps, to be liberated. I mean, that's where all the photos, the famous photos of the piles of dead bodies and the skeleton-like survivors that we've seen since we were in school, that's where they came from the American photographers, journalists, newsreel people that were there. Some of you may have heard, I've written 2 books that focus a lot on Edward R. Murrow, the great CBS broadcast correspondent. And he did an extraordinary broadcast about Buchenwald. He was there when American troops liberated it, and it is one of the most staggeringly powerful broadcasts I've ever heard. So anyway, those 2 and other German concentration camps were well known because they were covered by journalists. Ravensbrück was it was about 40 miles north of Berlin, and it was liberated by Soviet troops, much later than some of the other camps. And there were no journalists along for the ride. And so there were no photographs, or at least none that we have seen. And after it was liberated, it remained in the Soviet zone of post-war Germany. So the Soviets made it into a military camp. And it really was totally forgotten, or pretty much forgotten, as were the women who were there. And that really wasn't the purpose, because I thought most people had heard of it. It wasn't to reveal what Ravensbrück. It was to write the story of this group of, it's a group of French women who were arrested by the Gestapo and sent to Ravensbrück. They were in the resistance, in the French resistance, and sent to Ravensbrück, and basically banded together to help each other survive, for one thing, but also to resist the Germans within the camp. And that story hasn't really been told, or hadn't been told. In fact, the whole story of women in the French, I'm blathering on here.
So let me just interrupt you for one. So there were women at Dachau, there were women at Buchenwald. Why one camp just for women, and what women were sent there? Political women?
It was mostly women from resistance movements around Europe. There were others. Prostitutes, minor criminals, but I'd say 80% of the women that were there had been in the resistance in various countries, not just France. I mean, there was in Germany, in Russia, in Poland. Poland had by far the best organized resistance movement in all of Europe. The Netherlands, Belgium, they all had resistance movements, and the Nazis sent, it was mostly these women that came to the camp. Why was it the only female? Why did they, have an all-female? It's not really clear. It was a labor camp. It was not a death camp. It was not an extermination camp. So most of the extermination camps, which was for immediate killing, were in Poland. This was a labor camp, but it was really still a death camp. It was a slow death camp. Mm-hmm. Women were taken there. They were slave labor. They were used as slave labor. And so the Germans made money off them. It was run, the head of the SS Heinrich Himmler, ran all the German concentration camps. And he owned the land that Ravensbrück was on. And he made money he made a profit from these women. They were sent out to factories, munitions factories, etc., near Ravensbrück, but also all over Germany. And he was paid for them. Most of them, they were not treated well. The food was, it was just awful. They eventually died. It was a slow death, though, but not a quick death.
You mentioned that it was not a death camp, but it didn't start that way. But they did put in cremation facilities at that camp later.
Well, they execute. I mean, a lot of women died of starvation and disease, but they were executing them all along the way. Hanging, shootings. Toward the end of the war, because it was the only all-women camp, the Germans were closing other camps and sending women into Ravensbrück, and so it was astronomically huge at the end of the war. And so they had to get rid of women quick. So they established a gas chamber in the last 7 months of the war. And even that, they couldn't keep up with the number of women who were coming into the camp.
You mentioned that they banded together. One of the things I thought was so, it's a tough book to read because you describe the conditions they lived under as pretty wretched. Unimaginably bad. But they banded together, and in many ways, they drove their guards crazy.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Tell us some of the stories about it. And they saved many women many lives by outwitting their guards,
right,
basically.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that I love, this is the third book that I've written about women, all of whom were in the French Resistance. So I focused on England early in the war. Citizens of London is part of that. But the last 3 books have been about women and about France and the French Resistance. And what I love about French women, and it's very much on parade in this book, is they have this anarchic sense of humor. I mean, the French do anyway. But the caustic, anarchic sense of humor, and basically won't let people, with these women particularly, won't let people tell them what to do. These women, my God, they were fierce. They were mostly young. They were in their late teens, early 20s, most of the women I write about. But they grew up in a very patriarchal, conservative society and refused to follow the guidelines of that conservative patriarchal society. They were independent, bold, etc. And they continued that in the camp. And just to give you a very quick example of how they stood up to the Germans, one of them, the main character in this book, her name is Germaine Tillion. She was an anthropologist. She was France's version of Margaret Mead. She actually, in the camp, she was the leader of this group. She, in the camp, wrote an operetta musical review making fun of the Germans, complete with songs and dances. They hid her. She was on a
She wrote this in the camp.
In the camp. She was on a work detail unloading trains that were coming in from all over Europe with goods, most of them taken from Jews. And she hid her fellow workers, hid her in a big carton for 10 days where she wrote this musical operetta. And it was songs and dances, as I said. It was songs that she made up the lyrics but used music that, she was very musical. She used music that was very familiar to the French at that point. So anyway, she does this. Of course, they can't stage it because they would have been killed, But she taught the songs and dances to her fellow French inmates, and they would sing the songs as they marched off to work. And the Germans loved marching songs, and and their guards were going along marching, and they had no idea, obviously, because they were singing in French. They had no idea what these songs were really saying, which was basically "screw you." But it is the most incredible piece of work, and we can talk about it later. But it was to raise the spirits of the women at Ravensbrück. She wrote it in 1944 when these women were pretty sure that they were going to die, that they were not going to be liberated. And she wrote it specifically to say, look, it's not over yet. She kept saying laughter is the best way to resist. And it is, when you think about it. Look at Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, it really is, seriously. Laughter is, if you can ridicule the people who are oppressing you, it is a very, very strong weapon. But that's just one example. I mean, these women really did drive the Germans mad. I'm sure many of you have heard the term Maquis, M-A-Q-U-I-S. It's resistance members in France, who took to the forests and were saboteurs, etc. They called themselves the Maquis of Ravensbrück, and they lived up to that name.
One thing that surprised me about the book, unless I missed it, is I didn't see. You talk about the conditions they lived under. I didn't see any discussion of sexual abuse, but it must have been rampant in the camp, right?
It's really interesting. I think the Germans, there wasn't that much. No,
Really?
unlike the Russians, the Germans, the SS, it was SS guards who, they considered them, below the pale. They didn't want anything to do with these women. These women became, to maintain your humanity in places like this was almost an impossible thing to do, and it's a miracle that they were able to do it, because, I mean, these women looked like hell, just several weeks into their time there, and after they'd been there, they looked like skeletons. But as far as I know, there really wasn't that much.
You also talk about, toward the end of the war, it was the policy of the Allies, starting with Eisenhower, not to liberate people who were in the death camps. Why? Why not?
It was the whole...
I mean, Hitler, his goal was to kill all of them before they were discovered, right?
And kill everybody in all the concentration camps. Well, it wasn't just Eisenhower. It was the American and British, particularly the American philosophy was, we have to win the war, and then we can worry about liberating all these people. Meanwhile, these people are dying, by the hundreds and thousands every day. But they meaning the Allied commanders, absolutely refused to consider liberating those. I mean, not only the camps in Germany, but the camps in Poland, until the war was won, until we had won the war, and that is still, as I'm sure you all know, a subject of great controversy now, particularly with the death camps. I mean, with the Jewish death camps, that nothing was done to stop that. But I mean, they from really right from the beginning, they insisted on, once we get the war won, we will take care of the rest.
And so Ravensbrück was really then one of the last ones.
It was one of the last ones. It was liberated in May, the end of April, early May of 1945, just before the war in Europe ended. But most of them, not all, but most of the women, certainly the French women, were liberated, thank God, before that by the Swedish Red Cross, who sent in a rescue mission and got more than 8,000 women out of Ravensbrück, including thousands of Jews. When Auschwitz was closed, several thousand women, Jewish women, were marched from Auschwitz to Ravensbrück. And so there were a lot of Jewish women in Ravensbrück, but I think 3,000 or 4,000 Jewish women were saved thanks to this Swedish mission.
Maybe half your book is dedicated to the time, post-war time of Ravensbrück, when, and you indicated this a little earlier, the role of women in the resistance and in the concentration camps was really dismissed almost, or not taken seriously, right? I mean,
Right.
de Gaulle said this was mainly a manly exercise, whatever.
Right. Yeah. Women were the lifeblood of the resistance, not only in France, but all over the occupied Europe. I mean, without women, the resistance could not have operated. Women were absolutely essential. And in France particularly, France was, the resistance was as sexist in France as everything else was in France. And so even though women had played a huge role during the war, the men basically, after the war, took all the credit and put the women in the background. As you say, Charles de Gaulle was leading the charge. You know, it's just men who did. His niece is one of my main characters in this book. His niece, Geneviève de Gaulle, was in Ravensbrück leading the resistance. And you know, that didn't matter to de Gaulle. Yeah. So it was really outrageous how they did try to basically obliterate the contributions of women. The women in my book wouldn't stand for that.
So their role was dismissed. Charles de Gaulle, again, an entirely male affair is
Right.
what Charles de Gaulle said, even though his niece was in Ravensbrück. So then their role is kind of dismissed. But then there's finally some kind of an investigation, which really turned out to be not a serious investigation, as you report, of what happened in Ravensbrück. Tell us about that, right? The British, they held hearings investigating what happened at Ravensbrück.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the horrible things. Yeah, there was a lot. I thought I knew everything about World War II. Obviously, that's not true. But I thought I knew more than I turned out in this book. And maybe some of you are familiar with the fact that, you know, we think of the trials at Nuremberg. We think that the criminals were brought to justice. And the big guys were, there's no question. But the vast majority of the killers, the German killers, were let go or were never investigated. Just an example of Ravensbrück, I think maybe 40 or 50 people of the thousands of guards, etc., who were in Ravensbrück and who basically killed many of these women and certainly were responsible for the horrific conditions they were in. Only about 40 were actually brought to trial. That's all. But 2 of them were the commandant at Ravensbrück and his number 2, who were really awful guys. They escaped, and they were finally tracked down in the late 1940s. And the women from Ravensbrück insisted that they be brought to trial. And the Americans initially captured them and were really reluctant to turn them over to the French, but they finally did. There was a trial. These women testified at that trial, and both of them were executed.
And then came the question of reparations. Again, initially not well received.
Right. It wasn't really reparations that I write about in this book. It was for the French. I mentioned the Poles before. The Poles, as I said, were extraordinary in terms of their resistance activities. And the women in Poland were really, really very much in that fight. So there were a lot of Polish prisoners at Ravensbrück. And many of them, 70 or 80 of them, young women, were guinea pigs in horrific medical experiments. that the Germans performed at Ravensbrück, really horrific. And a number of them died, but the majority did live, even though they were crippled for life, most of them. So after the war, the West German government, which assumed responsibility for what the Nazis had done, refused to give them any compensation. They gave other victims in the camps compensation, but they refused to give these Polish women compensation. So the French women went to bat for them and began a campaign. I go into great detail about this campaign that involved several very prominent people in this country, in the United States, this campaign to get justice for these Polish women, and it took 10 years, but they finally did. And that was one of the things I really enjoyed writing, how they...
Norman Cousins, fact, led the campaign to bring justice for these women.
Norman Cousins, the editor of Saturday Review. Some of you may remember or have heard about it. It's one of the great literary magazines in the current affairs in literary magazines in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you know.
And there's an the United States Senate role here too, right? Because Norman Cousins brought these women to the United States Senate.
Right. I mean, that was part of the...
and it was a very bipartisan support that they received there. Tell us about it.
They brought some of these maimed women to the U.S., and they went on a tour of the U.S., and of course, there was great publicity about what had happened to them in the war. They were heroines in the war, and they'd suffered enormously, and the Germans refused to give them compensation. So, you know, newspapers all over the country, magazines all over the country wrote stories about them. And this tour ended, the grand finale was in Washington, where all the, it was bipartisan, it was mainly the Senate, took these women to lunch, and then after lunch they got up one by one, and you know, the top senators, I can't remember now who they,
let me mention some names. Mike Mansfield, right? Thomas Dodd, Chris Dodd's dad. Kenneth Keating from New York. Eugene McCarthy, Minnesota. Ed Muskie, Maine. And Muskie who's Polish and was probably the leader of this group, if you will, according to your book, I trust.
So, I mean, you can imagine the headlines that made, and that was probably one of the key reasons. And obviously, a number of these senators were on the Foreign Relations Committee, and so they had some say in what went on, and you know, aid to West Germany. And so the West Germans finally saw the light, and I think the debate in the Senate, or the series of speeches, especially Muskie's speech, which was just astonishing because he was Polish. His father had come over from Poland. So I think that was a major reason why the women finally did get their due.
Now, I wouldn't call this a happy ending because there's no happy ending at all if you talk about Ravensbrück, but there was some recognition, final recognition.
Yes.
You mentioned Germaine Tillian and Geneviève de Gaulle,
right,
who now reside where?
They reside in, well, very quickly, they reside in the Pantheon, the French Pantheon, I assume most of you probably know. The Pantheon is kind of the last resting place for the great and the good of France. I mean, we're talking about very few people. In 2015, there are only 71 heroes buried in the Pantheon. Writers, Voltaire, I mean, statesmen, generals, whatever. So 71 people, 70 men and one woman. The one woman was, can anybody guess? Marie Curie. So 70 men, one woman. So in 2015, the president of France announced 4 new people that were going to be inducted into the Pantheon. 2 men, 2 women. And the 2 women were Germaine Tillion and Geneviève de Gaulle. And it was obviously to honor them for what they had done, but also to honor, finally, official honoring of the women of the French Resistance. And so, yes, that is, you know, it is, there, you're right, there is no happy ending, but it did at least, you know, acknowledge what these women had done.
We want to get to your questions, but before we do, I have to ask you a couple of things about Empress of the Nile. It's just such an outstanding book. Again, about a woman, not well known, but what a hero, right? And what great things she did for all of us, right? For Western civilization. So Christiane de Roche Nobelcourt, right?
Right, perfect.
Okay, so you tell us, she saved many of the ancient temples in Egypt, which were about to be destroyed by the Aswan Dam, correct? How'd she do it? And who was she?
Who was she? Christiane de Roche Nobelcourt was one of these women. I mean, you know, the women wrote about in Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, she actually was captured by the Gestapo. She was in the resistance. And that's what led to this book. I mean, doing that book. She was a curator, she was a young Egyptologist. She worked at the Louvre. And when the war broke out, she worked at the Louvre during the day, and she was in the resistance at night and on the weekends. She was just incredible. I mean, she was everything I've talked about, bold, outspoken. She was raised by parents who said she could do anything, which again was very unusual for parents. She came from the haute bourgeoisie, but she absolutely refused to listen to if somebody told her if she couldn't do something, she just totally ignored them. And she was one of the very, very few female Egyptologists. Archaeology in France, is a big deal in France, as you probably know. And it's was a very, very male world, especially when she got into it, which is in the 30s. She went to the École du Louvre in the early 30s, and was basically shunned by her male classmates, which she basically took as a reason why she should be much better than they were. So she joined the resistance during the war. After the war, then she stayed with the Louvre and became, one of the leading Egyptologists. She got involved with the temples because of Nasser. I mean, it's a long story. Nasser became president of Egypt in the drawing a blank.
40s, maybe 30s or 30s?
No. It was any of you guys.
Oh.
Senator Byron, I don't know. Anyway, in the 50s. He led a coup against the British, who were really running Egypt, and the king of Egypt, who was basically their tool. And the coup was successful. And this is an astonishing little factoid. When he took power in Egypt, he was the first Egyptian to run Egypt since Cleopatra. No kidding. I mean, from Cleopatra, after Cleopatra on, foreign powers were basically ruled Egypt. So he was the first. And so, as you may know from history, your history, the Western governments didn't like him. He was a nationalist. They thought he was pro-Soviet. He really wasn't in the beginning. He was a nationalist, and he wanted his country to be in charge of. He wanted the Egyptians to be in charge of his country. So he decided to build the Aswan Dam, or to replace the Aswan Dam with this fabulous new dam that would provide tons of electricity and would help agriculture, and it would also destroy 20 to 30 of the most priceless Egyptian temples. But basically, he and his men said, we're for the future, really not the past. And so Christiane was appalled by that and basically said, you can't do that. Well, she was the only one really who kept saying you couldn't do that. Everybody else was saying, well, that's the way we're going to do it. We're going to do it. And through sheer force of will, she managed to persuade the cultural minister in Egypt and Key, a top person at UNICEF, to join her very lonely crusade to save these temples. And if it hadn't been for Christiane, we wouldn't have had temples at Abu Simbel. I don't know if some of you have seen them. I mean, I write a great deal. We wouldn't have had the Temple of Dendur. You know, if you go to the Metropolitan, you wouldn't have that lovely annex with the Temple of Dendur because it would be under 400 feet of water. But she, as I said, through sheer willpower, managed to create this campaign to save these temples. And everybody said, I mean, you could understand why they thought that. It's crazy. I mean, to do that, you would have to move these ancient 3,000, 4,000-year-old temples that are made of sandstone. You know, sandstone's very crumbly stone. You have to move them up and back from the riverbank. How in the world are you going to do that? So I go into great detail in this book explaining how all the ideas that people came up with and none of them were going to work, and it looked impossible. It looked absolutely impossible. But the bottom line is that she managed to persuade enough people to get involved in the campaign. And in fact, they did work out a way to move all these temples, cut them up basically, many of them, cut them up in blocks and move them, to a spot where they would actually, be saved. And as I said, nobody really expected this to work. Nobody, but it did. And they're there. And so anybody going to Egypt, when you go down the Nile and you see Abu Simbel and you see several of the others, it was because of Christiane de Roche-Noble-Corp.
Incredible story. And if I can just add a footnote, one of the things that an idea she came up with, persuaded the Egyptian government to invite other nations who wanted to join this, that if they would pay a certain amount, they could get their own temple. They could take one of these temples home with them. And somehow she got Jackie Kennedy interested in this. And Jackie Kennedy said to Jack, let's save a temple. Jack probably said, shit, I don't care, why not, right? And he put up the money, and that's the Temple of Dendur at the Metropolitan Museum.
It was the Kennedys. It was Jacqueline Kennedy who was really the power behind the throne, and she kept on her husband, sending him memo after memo saying, we've got to save these temples, we've got to save these temples. And he probably basically did have that attitude. But he did. I mean, he authorized, or he asked Congress to authorize money for that.
And we don't have time to talk about the citizens on it, but don't forget this one. And all of these are available right outside that door. So, Lynne, so great to have you here. Thank you so much.
It's wonderful to be here. Absolutely. Thank you.
And some of you might have thought about a question. We covered so much ground here. Marianne has a microphone.
If you have a question, okay.
Start, okay.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering how you did your research on this. I mean, particularly for the German, were there Stasi records, or, I mean, was it in the American press, or how did you find out
the Ravensbrück
the story? Did you interview any of the people?
For Ravensbrück.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually there are there's a fair amount of information. Well, first of all, I focus on 4 women, and all 3 of them wrote memoirs, which is always wonderful for a would-be biographer or whatever to find. And this group of women founded an organization called, the acronym is ADIR, A-D-I-R, after the war, to basically help each other recover from what they had been through, and to remind the world of what they had accomplished for France. And that organization has, all their records are in a university and library in Paris. So there's tons of information. But I would say the best source that I had came from a filmmaker, a young American filmmaker who did a documentary on these 4 women, actually, and it came out in 1990. And you can actually rent it. It's called Sisters in Resistance.
Sisters
in Resistance.
in Resistance.
It's available if you Google Vimeo. You can rent it for $4. It's wonderful. So, but her name is Maya Wexler. She's from Washington, actually. She interviewed these 4 women over the course of probably 6 years, from the late 80s till the the early 80s to the late 80s, when these women were in their 70s and 80s, but still really with it. So she had, I think she had 28 hours of interviews of these women separately and together over the course of that time. And I can't tell you what a gold mine that was. I mean, they're available in this library. They opened up to her in a way that I hadn't seen. I mean, they talked about their early lives. They talked about how they got involved in their resistance. They talked about their mothers, how important their mothers were. They talked about, of course, their sisterhood at Ravensbrück, how important they were to each other. They talked about after the war. It was just filled with wonderful, wonderful human vignettes. And that's, I really focus on people in my books. I mean, they have to be, that I tell the story through people. And so this was just amazing. And there has been, this is the first book like this, but these women have appeared in other books. And many of the quotes, et cetera, come from Maya's interviews. She is a character in this book, by the way, and her story and how she managed to do this book is...
Okay. Marianne, here in the front. I think we need to use the microphone because we're recording the event, and so please wait for the microphone to ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. Your book sounds fascinating. All of them do, but I'm focused particularly on Ravensbrück. I'm especially interested in accountability. So I'm wondering, why were the Polish women subject to medical experiments denied reparations in the first place? You would think that sounds horrific, that they very much deserve them. And then could you describe further about the reparations given to everyone? How were they meted out? Were they significant? And finally, I think you mentioned that only about 40 guards were prosecuted. Was there an effort later to prosecute more, or was that kind of the end of it?
Okay, let's see. I'll start from that one. No, I mean, what I found, and this really surprised me, is that once the Cold War began, which, as you know, began fairly soon after the end of World War II, the enemy changed. And so Germany was now our friend, our ally. And our enemy now was the Soviet Union. So basically, the US led the charge of this, that they wanted to get out of this prosecution business. And that's one of the main reasons why these people were not prosecuted. You know, if you as a war criminal managed to survive into the 50s, the chances are that you certainly wouldn't be executed. You probably would go to jail and probably would get out very quickly. And that's what happened. A lot of these people that they weren't executed, some of them did go to jail, but in the early 1950s, they were let go, because now we were focusing on the Russians, not on the Germans. We wanted to make nice with the West German government. As you know, there was still a lot of Nazis around. A lot of Nazis actually were in the West German government, but let bygones be bygones. Now, you know, Werner von Braun came to the U.S. and, you know, led our space program. So that was one of the main reasons. And what was?
I was interested in reparations. First of all, why were the Polish women denied them? And then, in general, how were they meted out?
The reparations, it was the Cold War again, because they were from Poland, which had been taken over by Stalin, thanks to Churchill and Roosevelt giving Poland to Stalin. It was a communist country, and the West Germans were not going to give any money to anybody who lived in a communist country. So, I mean, it was catch-22. And basically, thanks to this the brilliant publicity campaign that Norman Cousins and others ran, the publicity got so bad for the West German government, they finally agreed. I can't remember exactly how it was meted out. It was certainly was not enough. It was not enough, but it was, back then it was I would say the equivalent of 100,000 probably for each person, or something like that. But it was not just the money, it was finally the recognition that in fact these women had suffered.
Right. Anyone else here looking for the microphone? Right over here? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm actually not going to ask a question about the book, but I want to ask about something that you might have learned from studying these women. So we are in a time, I'm guessing many of us share this perception, where resistance is important, and where the ability to resist is something we're all seeking, like what works and what doesn't. What was the quality about these women that you learned that makes it possible to risk your own life, really, to resist? It's one thing to be in the camp where your life is threatened, but they got themselves into that situation because they took all these chances.
Right.
What was that uniting quality?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. I mean, I think part of it goes back to the kind of person they were, the kind of women they were, and they were risk takers. There's a wonderful quote from a prominent British World War II historian who talked about that resistors had one common trait, and that was a streak of contrariness, a streak of contrariness, and that's what these women had in spades. You know, again, being women, it was even more unusual, but they were independent. They refused to let people stand in their way. There's a wonderful quote from one of the women that I write about saying, you know, we were fighting for a country that had denied us our basic human rights, but it was still our country, and we were prepared to die for it. And that, I think that basically summed it up. They were among the very few, and at least initially, French women and men who were so outraged by France's capitulation that early on they were so angry that Pétain had capitulated that they were just determined to do whatever they could to drive the Germans out at a time when virtually nobody in France was doing that. So they were very, very unusual, to put it mildly.
Yes, please. There we go. Just pass over the mic, right?
I have read all of your books, and I'm a huge fan of all of your books, and this one is no different. I'm curious how you decide to approach a topic, because when you look at this topic, you think, I don't know, I can read about one more concentration camp, or, it's like it's enough. With all the history I've read over the course of time. But this is really a story of resilience for a lot of these women and how they helped each other after the war. So how do you decide how to approach a topic as you're writing a book?
That's a really, really great question. It depends. It depends on the topic, how I'm going to frame it. I'll tell you I'm going to answer your question, but I'll tell you very, very quickly about Citizens of London. Bill and I were talking about it earlier. I actually set out what I wanted to do is write a book about John Gilbert Winant, the American ambassador. And because I had never heard of him until I found out about him, and I just thought he was incredible. But I knew that a publisher, he was unknown. That was the point, to make him better known. But publishers don't like books about unknown people. You can write the 3 millionth book on FDR, but not one on John Gilbert Winant. So I had to figure out a way to frame it so that a publisher would want to write it. And so I threw in Edward R. Murrow and Averil Harriman, and that's that book. And
we've all heard about Averil.
We've all heard about Averil.
And Pamela.
And but Citizens of London, Robin's book was hard. I had a hard time trying to figure out how to deal with it. It was a tough book to write. It really was, especially the part about, obviously about the camp and what they went through. But what convinced me to write it was, first of all, I thought they were the perfect people to write about in this day and age, because I think what their story says, it shows the enormous power ordinary people have, even in the worst of times, if they band together to fight. And that really appealed to me. And it also appealed to me as I learned more about their story afterwards. And it was really uplifting. How they joined together to help each other, recover. None of them ever really fully recovered, but recover as much as they could from what they had been through, and then to lead such incredible lives after that. Of the four, 3 of them married and had kids, but went on to do astonishing things. And I just thought, it is a triumph of the human spirit. That's what they show, and that's what really appealed to me. But it really was the time. I tell you what, the first time Trump was elected, I was so depressed. I decided I was immediately going to write a book, and so and that was Manafort's Secret War. And the second time he got involved, that's when I decided to write Sisterhood of Robbinsboro.
Lynne, thank you so much for this evening. A nice round of applause for Lynne Olson.